So thank you so much for coming. Thanks so much to the team for putting this madcap idea together. The plan was to have something like a Gresham lecture without the madness of preparation or the stress. We got rid of the first one. But I'm very grateful to my fellow professors to come here and talk about music with me today. So I want to say a little bit about the college, for those who might know about it. This college that you're in now was founded upon the will of Thomas Gresham in 1597. And here's his will right here. And it says that 7 professors will be appointed in the fields of divinity, astronomy, music, I love the extra K, geometry, law, physics, and rhetoric. And the Gresham sign is this grasshopper, by the way, that you'll see everywhere. In fact, I noticed if you look closely at the will, we're promised apartments as well. I haven't got mine yet. Here's the earliest images of our ancestors. And we were given really specific tasks to educate the public. First of all, it was for free to anybody who wanted to learn, which is progressive even to this day. There are particular guidance, especially for the astronomy reader. His lecture should be read in a solemn manner, and I don't think Chris is really living up to that. But what's extraordinary is you think about these first professors, and in 1597, and what's happened over those 400 years and what we've learnt. And I just did a few things that have happened over these 400 years. It's just extraordinary breakthroughs in knowledge, but also breakthroughs in how we think about ourselves. We've had to struggle with the idea that we're not the center of the universe, that we're not the center of the animal kingdom, that we're not the center of our own minds, and that our genes can be coded, and maybe machines can think like us. These are huge things that we have to bear. Music, I could put Bach to the Beatles, to Bossa and Bartok and things not starting with B, but basically, it's just beautiful sounds that have happened all along this. What have we learnt about music? In fact, musicians aren't very good at talking about music. There are certain guidance they give each other, like if you do a leap up, you should descend. Turns out that's not the case. It's a regression to the mean. So they're not very good at understanding what music is. The biggest breakthroughs in music happen when they intersect with these other disciplines. Music theory can be seen as the intersection of music and geometry. Or astronomy or physics tells us about the physics of sounds, acoustics. And today we're looking at these intersections about what music is, because it's very hard to explain what it is, with the biology, what it does to our brains, how it convinces us of our humanity. But I'm in the viewpoint that music also has the power to communicate about these other disciplines. For example, if we attach the growth of crystals onto a piano, music emerges. There's a logic that unfolds. So what you're listening to now is being played by salt crystals. Or as we go through a sleep through the night, we can have it read like a score, an orchestral score. The top line is us struggling to fall asleep. The bass line is body position. So our lives are constant melodies. I've done projects like this, which is the cases of Ebola across Africa. And this is it's not scoring, it's systematic. The number determines what musical fragment emerges. And you can feel the drama of the events in the language of music. Similarly, who knew that if you put a hexagon through a line, it sounds like Eric Satie? And the amount that it turns gives you gesture and motivic expression. We can also feel waves of public opinion. This is the petition to revoke Article 50 during the Brexit negotiations. And basically, in real time, I set up this keyboard to play a note every time someone signed this petition. And you get the events happening through the day. So there's the date right here. So 5 to 8 signatures per second. This is the morning. And you remember Theresa May did that press release a little later, and then it goes bonkers. It's very compelling. Oh. I like taking credit for other people's signing of petitions. It's very compelling. It didn't work, but we have this sense that we're returning to this early days of ancient Greek and Renaissance philosophies where music is actually combined with these other disciplines. For example, there's this idea that Newton brought forward that the colors and the notes can be connected. And nowadays, I can build tools which will read through. You can turn this up a little bit if you would. And basically, as it reads through, you get to hear the color change that occurs in these beautiful images. During the pandemic, I worked with a scientist comparing how quickly the COVID genome mutated. It's extraordinary. And what happened every time there was a mutation, it would automatically trigger a voice in the choir. So if the mutations happened in a certain part of the genome, you would have this motif that would recur. And it turns into this 42-minute choir piece where if there was no mutations, it would be completely silent. But you get these gorgeous motifs. So you start to learn about the music of the cell itself. I'm currently working on turning London itself into a piece of music, essentially putting a stave across it. So the architectural style turns into musical motifs. I promise this isn't all about me, but I just think it's very interesting that we've come to this point again which feels full circle, where these disciplines are different ways of seeing the same thing. It's not a book launch today, but if you want to know more, I have a book. 4 Warnings for Piano is 4 lines on the piano: CO2 level, temperature, sea level, and ice mass, and it's quite hard to argue with the melodic trajectory. So today, I just wanted to remind us that we should not be arrogant about what we know now. I'm sure that these early professors were confident in the state of the world, and as Mitchelson said, he suggests that science only has some refinement to do and no major breakthrough. But I think we should be humble and put ourselves in the finery of these original professors. So we can imagine what they had left to learn and what we could give. So they existed here, and we are at this point. And we should look at this great ocean of truth before us. There's these quotes from all our disciplines about the importance of humility and doubt. And with that sentiment, I would love to introduce you our first speaker, Professor Robin May. Thank you so much. Thanks,
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm not sure I can follow that. Thanks for coming today. I'm Robin May. I am, without the wig and the wonderful 17th century attire, the current Gresham Professor of Physics. And what I want to do over the next half an hour is try and convince you that everything that you think about for music, all the kind of personality, all the character, all of the kind of enjoyment you get out of it, is actually just a bit of biology gone wrong. And then please don't all leave at the end of that and ignore the rest of the afternoon, because everyone else will convince you that's completely untrue. So the whole point about music is that music drives a huge amount of our culture and plugs into our kind of our beings. And we're going to do this as a bit of a free-fall lecture, because all of about 15 minutes ago, Milton and I added a few slides in, and I might see if we can do a bit of ad-libbing and make him work even harder, unfortunately, for the work he's done today. And we'll see how we go. So if it ends up deviating from the script, hopefully that won't be a problem. If we think about music and its impact, you can see this going back in kind of the history of humanity for a long time. So this is a good way to start. I think this is Orpheus, who those of you familiar with Greek mythology will know was famous as the most melodic of people ever, who could charm the animals from the trees, and in fact even persuaded the god of the underworld to let him in to go and rescue his dead wife. Didn't end well, unfortunately, but with the power of his lyre, which you can hopefully hear here. Not actually his lyre, I'm afraid, but a modern reincarnation of it. So at least from ancient Greek times, people were convinced of this idea that music could drive all sorts of behaviors in people, and indeed in the gods in that case. Which for me as a biologist raises the interesting question about where did music come from biologically? Where did it evolve? How did it come here? And what's its purpose? And in terms of where it came from, we're kind of working on this principle of going as far back as we possibly can. And this is still at the moment the oldest kind of incontrovertible evidence, I think, of music in humans. So this is something called the Hohle Fels flute, which was discovered in Germany and is dated to about 40,000 years old. And it is inarguably a musical instrument created 40,000 years ago, we assume by Homo sapiens, by our ancestors. And the power of modern magic allows us to hear it, and it sounds a little bit like this. Marvelous. And the really interesting thing about that, which you're going to hear from Milton in just a second, is that this appearance in the archaeological record of 40,000 years ago, the first time we see any kind of evidence of music, is also the first time we see evidence of what you might call representational culture or art in humans. So this is the Venus, dug up at the same time, same age, 40,000 years, and is the first really good example we have of humans making art that is designed to represent something. In this case, a rather overindulgent lady. But there are other examples of that. Prior to this, we have art from humans, but they are abstract. They're stripes and lines and squares and things, not things meant to represent other things. And I think it's really interesting that we see these two things appearing at the same time in the human record. And even more interestingly, it turns out that the music of the flute is quite remarkable, and Milton's going to tell you why.
So you might have found that pleasant. And that's not an accident, because it turns out that us humans have something called a sensory dissonance curve, where certain intervals sound harsh and certain sound consonant. For example, the octave is near equivalent. And so that flute has an octave, and it repeats at the octave. So that's a first instance of something that we find near universal across the planet. You'll also find that the lowest point of dissonance is at this, what's called the perfect fifth. It's almost as consonant an octave. And this one scale that the Hohle Fels flute sings has been found across the world. Sometimes you might call it the major pentatonic. You find it on the black keys of the piano, and it's named and renamed across the world. And what it does is it packs in as many fifths as you can. If you have 5 notes, that's the only way you can get as many fifths as you can. So it was a mathematical solution for something I'm sure they didn't have awareness of, but essentially it's an arc of fifths, that flute. There you go.
Brilliant. So who knew? 40,000 years ago, we were doing some pretty complicated maths, apparently. So I think it's really fabulous to see this idea that humans presumably had some kind of dramatic moment 40,000-ish years ago when they started to appreciate this complexity of musical structure. But as a kind of biologist, I think you need to have the kind of challenge question, say, well, is it truly unique to humans? Is it really only humans that did this? Or is there an argument for music being much older than that? And I think the jury is very definitely still out, but I think there is kind of a compelling case that music is perhaps not entirely human. And so this is a good example. This is from Kat Hobater's lab, who works on chimps, particularly this one is in the Budongo forest in Uganda. And is interested in this idea of chimp communication and chimp culture. And what you'll see here is this young male chimp is about to do something I think you could argue is music. So he's going to start by singing. As you can probably tell, there's a lady out of shot. And now he's going to drum. And that's enough. He's a bit shy now. He's gone away. So at a superficial level, you might say this is just a male chimp showing off to the female chimp who's out of eye shot, and you know, it's nothing to do with music. However, what Kat's lab have shown is that individual chimps drum in an individual style, and they evolve their style over time, and that different groups of chimps have a kind of musical culture. So you can identify, just by listening to the type of drumming, which troop provides that particular kind of music. And that, I think, is not a whole way removed from us thinking about, for example, the difference between Western European music and Far East Asian music, where you have a clear cultural significance associated to it. So I think there is an argument that maybe chimps are kind of on the cusp of musical development too. What about if we go further removed from humans? And I mean, I guess a very clear example of something that we think of as music is this bird song. Many of us get up unseasonably early to go and listen to things like this, and we appreciate it. You can buy LPs of bird song like this. This is a wren, obviously. And you could argue that this is a type of music. However, the argument against that is that as far as we can tell, these guys don't do it for fun. They don't sit there quietly listening to their own birdsong. They're doing it to demonstrate something. And actually, if you were to translate this birdsong, its translation is probably quite offensive, because he's basically saying, get off my land and hello, darling, in other words. It's not really music to the bird, even though it is to us. A much more difficult argument, I think, though, is when we start to think about music that feels very, very far removed from what we understand of as sound, but is clearly providing a much higher kind of intellectual input. And the best example, I think, is this. This is whale song. This is a humpback whale. And we are really just, at the moment, at the start of our discovery of what whale song really means. But what we do know already so far is that whale song is hugely individual. You can identify individual whales by the song they make. They learn songs over time. Their songs become more complicated as they age. They learn portions of songs from each other. And there is a cultural change over the globe, all of which feels very, very much like a lot of the music that we make. So I think it's quite difficult for us as humans to assume that we are unique, because probably if you're a humpback whale, you might be having this same lecture under the water at the minute and saying, there's this funny noise that you hear occasionally, you know, especially around London on the radio wavelengths. Don't know what's going on there. And so I think it's really important to keep that kind of lens. Okay, so let's assume for a minute, though, that music is human-specific, and has evolved with us in the relatively recent, at least in evolutionary terms, past. How has it evolved? And the first person really to speculate, and actually still one of the leading thinkers, I would say, on where music came from and how it evolved, is, of course, the great Charles Darwin, whose range of talent seems bottomless, as well as sort of figuring out the whole basis of evolution on his journey around the world on HMS Beagle. He also speculated on a whole variety of other interesting scientific phenomena, including music. And in his autobiography, he says something really quite interesting, I think. So he says how much he loves music. He acquired as a student a very strong taste for music, and often chose deliberately to go and listen to music, which is, of course, something that many of us do. He then goes on to say, well, first of all, he says something slightly dubious about hiring choir boys to sing to him in his rooms, which I guess in those days was okay. I wouldn't recommend anyone tries that now. But more importantly, he then makes this distinction. He says, I very much enjoy music, blah, 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 but I cannot perceive a discord or keep time or hum, et cetera, et cetera. And he goes on to say about his friends used to wind him up by trying to get him to identify music played backwards or played slowly, and he was complete failure. So he is distinguishing between this idea of the enjoyment of music, which for him is huge, and the ability to kind of understand it or produce it, which he has, by his own admission, no ability about. And so he realizes, and comments in his autobiography, that this is a process that distinguishes between music, if you like, the science, and music, the emotional driver. Because he says, rightly, music affects every emotion. I'm sure we've all had moments when you're listening to music and it makes you sad, or it makes you happy, or sometimes it enrages you, particularly if it's somebody else's music and it's really bad and really loud. But it plugs in to our emotional understanding. And Darwin realizes this, and so he speculates back then that the origins of music lie in courtship. So he is saying musical tones and rhythm were used by the half-human progenitors of man, what we would now call early humans, during the season of courtship, when animals of all kinds are excited by the strongest passions. So what he is arguing is that that process that the wren was demonstrating, that use of song or music to demonstrate territory, to attract mates, is the common ancestor of all music. And our very elevated modern music just derives from that kind of ancestral emotional state. And I think there's still today, actually, that's still quite a leading theory on why music has such a big impact on all of us. So, music affects our emotions, it plugs into our emotions. And to me, one of the most fascinating things about it is that it literally directly plugs into our physiology. There is a clear connection between the music you listen to and physiological processes in your body. And I'm going to demonstrate that right now with the help of, first of all, the great master. Here he is. This is Mozart, and he's going to play you a little bit. Sorry to cut you off, Mozart. A bit of Mozart record. We could listen all day, but we would still be here quite late tonight. So in listening to that, hopefully, I'm happy you're all going to go away appreciating the wonderful impact of Gresham on your lives, because I have, on average, just lowered your blood pressures. Not quite enough, unfortunately. 15 minutes of a bit of Mozart. Doesn't have to be the Requiem. 15 minutes of Mozart, on average, lowers blood pressure by about 5 millimeters of mercury, 5 units, if you like, which is quite a lot. For those of you who've been to the GP, or perhaps if you've had blood pressure problems, lowering your blood pressure by 5 units is quite a win. And so just by listening to Mozart, you could make quite a significant difference to your longevity.
Pulse is entrained with the pulse of the music? Or?
So partly it's to do with this entrainment, but partly it seems to be unrelated to the tone of the music, because it doesn't have to be Mozart. So for example, if you really can't stand Mozart, then A, shame on you, but B, you can trade out and you can listen to something like this. I'm not sure about the outfits.
We're going to wear that today.
I was going to say, I'm not sure the outfits do much for your blood pressure, but listening to ABBA also lowers your blood pressure, however, only by about 2 units. So twice as long with ABBA, half as long with Mozart. Take your pick, more or less the same win for blood pressure.
Have they done different styles?
They've done different styles.
Is anyone that increases?
Yeah, there are some that increase, yeah. That's usually for different reasons, though. So if you get ones that, we'll talk about that a bit later if we have time, actually. There are some that really drive kind of energy. They don't have the lasting effect on blood pressure like listening kind of calmly does. So there's something there about music kind of interacting with your physiology. And I think this, but to me, the best example of that is something that we're going to see now. So I want you to close your, so this is obviously Jacqueline Dupre, absolute masterpiece of cello, who obviously died tragically far too young. So if you're willing to go with me, I suggest you close your eyes a second and listen to Jacqueline here at her very best. With the exception of the crackles, you can open your eyes again now, with the exception of the crackles from the original recording, I like to think that for some of you, at least in the audience, that will have made you feel a little bit like this, very sort of chilled and relaxed. Some of you might possibly be sitting there thinking, why has this clown got me closing my eyes listening to a piece of music I absolutely loathe? That's a possibility. But I am prepared to wager that for at least some of you in the audience, you will have also experienced this during that piece of music. This is what's called a musical chill, right? A shiver down your spine, your hairs go up on end, and you feel, right? maybe not for this, and for many people that's something completely different, but that musical chill experience is something that is common to most of us across most types of music. And I'm going to tell you why that works biologically in a second. But first, Milton, I think, has some really interesting stuff from a previous lecture.
So last year, in fact, in my first lecture, we covered the chills, and there was quite a large survey that went out. And here we have the most chill-inducing artists, at least of you, the listeners. There's quite a diversity. In fact, there's diversity of pieces amongst these. So what do we know about what induces it, this strange phenomenon? And it's the listeners were asked to describe what happens and why they thought certain effects happen, shrill slides and so on. And it turns out there are a host of themes: a sudden change, anticipation, a sense of catharsis, a resolution, usually with some kind of twist, a sense of awe, dissonance, and so on. And there are two prevailing theories about how this happens. One is the idea of contrastive valence. Just like when we get a chill, it's usually when we're going from hot to cold or cold to hot. Similarly, we might have a really deep dissonance that suddenly becomes consonant, and musically we get that effect. Why that happens, we'll have to ask our guests, but that's one supporting hypothesis. And another one, which I find quite beautiful, is known as separation distress. It turns out that a lot of music that induces chills has an exaggerated shrill part of the frequency, about 2 to 4 kilohertz, which is higher than we can sing. It's like a harmonic way up there. And it's a sound that is very prevalent in babies' cry. You listen to it, it's got this bite at the top end of this. Horrible, isn't it? And it turns out that violinists, soul singers, really cut into this band. It's around here where I put this square. So let's listen to some isolated vocals from Mary Clayton on Gimme Shelter. And you can hear these squeaks come through, and maybe you'll have a moment of chill. Ooh.
It's just a shadow wave. It's just a shadow wave. Rape murder, yeah.
It's coming.
It's just a shadow wave.
Here.
It's just a shadow wave.
Oh, that's the one.
Rape murder. It's just a shadow wave. It's just a shadow wave.
And what that is supposed to induce is the fact, if anyone's had a baby in the house, you know that it's the most annoying sound, but also the most important one. It's the thing that you attend to immediately. So you have this moment of alertness, but then it's just almost a moment of nurturing, and you go and attend to it. So we have the hot and the cold, but we also have this importance and a very primal alert that we are tapping into.
And I think, I mean, that's fascinating to me, because I think that is exactly what also the biology suggests, that these musical chills are not something that we're under control of at all. They're plugging into our kind of very core biology. And they're plugging in fact, directly through your nervous system. So you might recall from school, your nervous system is actually a whole series of systems that do different things. So, for example, you have one part of your nervous system that is deliberately under our control for things like sight and sound and movement. And you can control whether you want your arm to do this or not. But there's another part of your nervous system, the so-called sympathetic nervous system, that is doing all this without your control. It's controlling things like heartbeat and kidney function and these kind of things. And it responds, without you having to think about it, to external stimuli, right? So if someone suddenly waves a gun in your face, for instance, you don't have to think, what shall I do about this person running a gun in my face? Your sympathetic nervous system will already start to raise your pulse rate and your heart rate and get you ready to hopefully run away. And so it's triggering these basal responses. And it is this nervous system which is responding to music in that way of a musical chill. And it turns out that when you hear music that chills you, what it's doing is triggering the release of opioids, so things that are related to heroin and opium, that are natural kind of signaling molecules within your body. They're used all the time, but the hearing that musical chill music triggers their release from nerves. And it is that release of those endogenous opioids that triggers things like your hairs on your arm standing up. What turns out to be really interesting, though, is you can separate these two parts of music. So if you give somebody a drug that is designed to prevent the release of these opioids, and these are drugs that are often used, for example, for people who are trying to get off a heroin habit, you can give people these drugs. They will block the release of opioids, and you can listen to Elgar or soul music or whatever does it for you, and you will not get that. Your hairs will not go up, you will not go. But interestingly, afterwards, if you ask those people, they will still have enjoyed the music just as much as if they hadn't had the drug. Which says that just as Darwin was suggesting, this idea of musical enjoyment is somehow separate from this kind of biological response that you make to music. And I think that's really interesting, this idea of music as a kind of art form that we appreciate versus music as a kind of biological signal. What also turns out to be very interesting is people's individual preferences. So what music gives you chills is highly variable, right? Some of you will have responded to Elgar, some to that soul music, some will be thinking, what on earth are these guys talking about? I don't like either of those pieces of music. It's very personal. But generally speaking, almost all of us from all around the world agree on some types of music being particularly bad. And the one that most cultures, most people around the world agree with is the idea of dissonant music, which most people find really, really unpleasant.
I'm fine with that.
Because it's pretty unpleasant. And the reason it's unpleasant, Milton is going to tell you about, and then I'm going to come back and tell you a bit more about why that is.
Oh, am I? Okay. Well, I don't find that unpleasant, but there is an acquired taste. So,
there's always one. There's always one, isn't there?
Well, as we'll find out later in Morton's talk, there is a certain... Dissonance is not a binary on-off thing, but it's like a flavoring. So it's like everyone wants a bit of salt. Some people like more chili than others. Dissonance has sort of many components. One thing that's very alerting about music is the use of timbre. Because what's interesting, you understand what we're saying, hopefully, because of the timbre of the voice. When I say A, E, I, O, U, the pitch isn't changing. It's just this internal structure that you are delineating. When we have music, we tend to have pitch and rhythm as the predominant descriptive force. But we have a acute awareness of timbre built in. So much so that if I just play two tones, one's on the one axis, one is on the other, and what I'm doing is basically boost these frequencies, you will start to hear vowels. It's wholly electronic, but you'll start to feel these vowels, perhaps. There's no pitch change, there's no rhythmic change, but it sounds like someone talking. They're not saying something very interesting, but they are talking. And so that we find that music tends to be dissonant when it bites into our language models, which might be someone screaming at us, essentially, or we feel like someone's angry. So language and music are very bound up together. Let's go to this one, I think.
Brilliant, thanks. And I think that gets to the heart of why we find dissonant music so unpleasant, is this idea that it is kind of plugging into something that is intuitive. And actually, one of the ideas about why we find dissonance so, if not kind of awful, but sort of perturbing, I guess, maybe in a good way, but still perturbing, is because the kind of music that's associated with dissonance, so this idea of jaggedness, for example, or discord, where you have non-harmonic notes together, are the same sort of sounds that very often come from things that are, in our evolutionary history, a threat. So, for example, a twig breaking is a dissonant sort of sound, or a rock slide coming down a mountain makes dissonant noises too. And it makes a lot of sense, at least to me, that during evolution, a huge sensitivity and aversion to noises that are associated with stuff like that.
That's really interesting, because there's a, sorry to butt in, but there's this model about how we get emotional responses to music. And what's interesting is that there are various components, and the order that we acquire them during our lifetimes seems to be sort of also the order that it occurred historically. And there's this first one, which is called brainstem reflex, which tends to be low rumbles, like earthquakes, something between your feet, and then sharp, high sounds, which are environmental, I guess.
Yeah.
So are you suggesting we have an inbuilt response to environmental danger?
Yeah, I think so.
Music?
And I think particularly, I think it makes sense to me that you would have acquired first the most basal things, threat noises or courtship noises, and much later on the more subtle stuff about, is this person my friend or not? Because the key ones that would have influenced early evolution are survival ones. And actually that's borne out slightly by when we start to think about things that can go wrong. So in fact, it's like we rehearsed this. We don't need to rehearse. We just do this ad hoc. Yeah, exactly. Who needs more than 3 minutes? So when you start to look at musical appreciation, one of the places we can learn a huge amount is when it goes wrong, particularly in individual people. And actually one of the things that is striking me now as we're having this conversation is that the most fundamental kind of errors, if you like, are the ones that affect those kind of very, very basic responses to things like dissonance. The much more subtle ones affect this kind of higher order. So what do I mean by that? So here's an example. So here's a brain scan. We're going up and down through an MRI scan of a brain. And in green, you'll see when it comes back through in a second, is a region called the parahippocampal gyrus. There it is. Let's stop everyone getting seasick and make that stationary. There we are. It sits here right at the brain stem, as you were just saying, Milton, right at the base of the brain. And it turns out that this part is the part of the brain that's really important for appreciating or not appreciating dissonance. So if you have a stroke in this region or you have a neurodegenerative condition that selectively removes this region of the brain, you will lose your aversion to dissonance. And all that music that we were just playing will be perfectly reasonable to you, actually. And this is indeed quite an ancestrally old part of the brain, so it's not unique to humans, it's found in other animals too, suggesting that this ability to discern dissonance is old evolutionarily. What's also interesting to me is if you lose this region of the brain, you lose your ability to find dissonance unpleasant, and you have two other things that are lost too. And I think the conjunction of the three is quite interesting. So the second thing you lose if you lose this part is your responsiveness to social cues, and in particular to things like sarcasm. So if I was to say to someone who'd lost this part, oh, it's nice and chilly today, isn't it? They would probably say, no, it's actually really quite hot, because they've lost that ability to discern sarcasm.
Do some people have that naturally? Because I've met them.
Yeah. We'll scan your brain later.
That's the sarcasm portion of the brain.
So sarcasm, dissonance,
really, is it?
and the third part, which is quite interesting, is they lose their understanding of scene. So for example, I don't know if people have been to Gresham before, but if you've been to Gresham before, you will recognize this room, and you will say, okay, I can see there's a screen, and there's a lectern, and there's some guy blabbing on at the front, and all these other things. Oh, I'm at Gresham. Whereas if you've lost this part, you will still recognize the screen and the lectern and the lecturer and everything else, but you will not be able to place it as Gresham where you've been before. And so that to me is quite interesting. So this ability to detect dissonance, the ability to perceive social interaction, and the ability to set a vision within a scene are all somehow connected in the brain. That's a pretty profound brain defect associated with music, but the most interesting ones I think we can learn from are the ones that are really, really very subtle indeed. And I'm going to introduce you to this one here. This is this is Monica's brain, obviously, but this is a lady called Monica. This is an MRI scan. You can ignore the colors, and you have to take my word for it. This is a completely normal brain scan. If you go into hospital and have your brain MRI'd, this is what you want to see. It's a perfectly healthy, in this case, at the time, she was, I think, 45-year-old lady's brain. And she was absolutely fine. The only reason she was having a brain scan is because she'd lived a perfectly normal life in Canada, and in relatively early middle age, I think, she had met and married a music teacher. Dangerous thing to do. Because presumably during their courtship, she said, I don't really like music. And when she said, I don't really like music, she really, really meant it. She had learnt musical instruments at school and done music lessons and all those kind of things, and she had successfully learnt a musical instrument, but she had literally zero appreciation of any kind of music. She did not enjoy classical or pop or anything else. She would never go to a concert. She had no appreciation of music at all. But otherwise, it was absolutely fine. And obviously, marrying a music teacher, that starts to become a bit of an issue, which is why she was having her brain scan. And it turns out that Monica has a remarkably selective brain defect in that she cannot discriminate pitch, but in a very, very specific way. So, if she hears a rising pitch that is only a semitone apart, like this, so she's pretty good at, she's pretty poor at discriminating that. The further it gets, the better it gets, okay? But at one semitone, which you can see down here, her ability to distinguish those as two notes is almost non-existent. Whereas up here at, where are we up, 4 semitones at the top, she's almost perfect.
It's a remarkable thing because a semitone might seem close because it's a close frequency, but it's much further than a fifth in musical terms, as we saw about that sensory distance curve. So it's a very strange condition to have, which I don't understand.
Exactly, and the even stranger part is that her ability to discriminate. So, for example, where were we? Let's do that rising. She's pretty good actually. She can spot this difference. But if you go the other way around and fall it, she can't distinguish it at all. Her ability is very dependent on the pattern with which the notes appear. And you can see that down here. So at falling pitch, even 11, so that is, where are we at? This is all that. So going this way around, she will identify it perfectly. That way around, they sound like two notes that are exactly the same. And perhaps unsurprisingly, because all notes sound the same, she doesn't enjoy any kind of music. We still have no idea why. There's no problem with her ears, there's no problem with her brain that we can see, and unfortunately it just means she doesn't enjoy music. And then this is perhaps an even more interesting case. This is another sort of brain scan, and this is slightly confusing. So this is, you have to imagine I'm looking at you, so this is the right-hand side of this is a gentleman's brain. He's about in his 70s, and he had an extremely mild stroke. So mild, he didn't realize he'd had a stroke. He got a bit dizzy, went to hospital, and they said, oh, you had a very mild stroke. And what you can see on this image, which reveals blood flow through the brain, is that the stroke has left him with impaired blood flow to one part of the right side of his brain here. He has no symptoms. He's walking perfectly well, he recognizes everyone, great memory, enjoys life, etc. The only long-term symptom he has is that for his previous 70 years, he was a huge music fan, big LP collection, used to go to concerts more than once a month, and after his stroke, he has no appreciation of any music at all. He doesn't like listening to any of it. All of his musical senses are completely unimpaired. So he, unlike Monica, can discriminate pitch, he can identify genre of music, he can tell you how musical chords are structured, all that kind of stuff, but he's just lost his enjoyment. And we don't know why, but something about this failed region in the brain is locked into his appreciation of music. So our brains are clearly hugely important in terms of our musical appreciation. One interesting question, I think, is therefore, is there a fundamental difference between the brains of people who are better at music and worse at music? And the great example, and the great answer, of course, is yes. These are not actually Milton's and my brains, but let's imagine they are for a minute. You have some people in the world who are professional, or at least highly skilled amateur musicians who live for music. And you have the rest of us. And what you can do is you can screen people, you can look at people's brain activity whilst they're listening to particular musical changes. So for example, here there's one that's a tritone fifth, so that's, I think, that difference. And as they're listening to that difference, you can scan their brains. And what you see is there are consistent differences between people who are either professional or highly advanced amateur musicians and the rest of us. So, for example, there are regions here that light up in the musicians and not in the non-musicians, and vice versa. What we don't know, of course, is whether this is cause or effect. Is this, was Milton born like this and I was born like this, bad luck? Or have we learned over years to develop particular parts of the brain? So we don't know whether they're kind of born or made, probably a bit of both. We do know, though, that there are at least some components which do trigger your inherited ability to be born a musician. And we know that in particular from genetics. And I'm sure many of you in this room might have already done this, where you send off a sample to have your whole genome sequenced, and it'll come back telling you you're 12% Italian and 6% Ghanaian, and by the way, you've got too much earwax and you love kind of cello or something, based on different genetic variants that we all have. So you can do that, a so-called genome-wide association study, for people who are musical or non-musical, and you can look for genes associated with musicality. And when you do that, you end up with a plot like this. So this is all the 20,000 human genes arranged along the bottom, if you imagine each one's a dot. And we're looking for genes that are significantly different in people who describe themselves as highly musical versus the rest of us. All the ones above the line show a statistically significant correlation with musicality. And there are loads, which is perhaps not that surprising, because we know that music is very complicated and comes on a spectrum, right? There are really talented musicians and kind of so-so musicians and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, there are a lot of genes that are associated with musicality. So at a first glance, you could do your genome, or perhaps your children's genomes, and you could work out, should I be placing a bet that my daughter is going to be, playing in the Berlin Philharmonic, or maybe I won't invest in those cello lessons after all, depending on their genetic complement. But before you rush off and do that, I want to give you a cautionary tale, and this is my cautionary tale. I think even if you're not a classical musician, you will recognize that this person here is quite a musical legend and wrote possibly the most famous 4 notes in musical history. There we go. Or even 8, there we go. So, clearly someone hugely musical, pretty easy to find out if he had all the genes, because fortunately, when Beethoven died, he was so famous that people kept locks of his hair. Slightly creepy, but they did. And now, thanks to modern technology, we can harvest DNA from Beethoven's hair, like this, and we can extract it, and we can sequence Beethoven's genome. Fabulous, which somebody did. And you can ask all sorts of interesting questions. For example, it turns out that one of his, I think, great-grandfathers was not his great-grandfather at all, so on and so forth. But one of the really interesting things you can do is then say, how many of these genetic variants for musicality did he have? And the answer is very few indeed. In fact, Beethoven is right down here. He is the 9th percentile. He is statistically highly unmusical on a genetic basis, which I think quite a lot of evidence would argue against. So finally, we've thought about all these kind of things about music and biology. Can we harness any of this to use music to our own ends? And of course, we can, and we do, in fact. And one of the first studies that showed this, I really love this study, this is from 1910, I think, when there was an annual cycle race, state-of-the-art cycles here, as you can see, across Yorkshire, I think. And some scientists at the time thought, I'm going to study the speed of this cycle race over all of its different legs. And what he realized was that as this cycle race came through certain villages would come out and they would cheer them on. And in some villages, the brass band would also come out and play them a tune as they went along to motivate them. Possibly. I'm not sure it really would motivate you, but either way. And it turns out that when there was a brass band playing, the cyclists on average went 8% faster than when they were only cheered on, which was the first example we have of
Not to get away from them.
Well, possibly, yeah. If it was that particular band, maybe it was. And that, of course, is something that we all know intuitively. So those of you who are crazy enough to have a gym pass, I expect when you go to the gym, there might be a kind of music playing, or maybe you put your own music on, that is designed to energize you, right? It's high tempo, high energy, lots of stuff happening. If you're into yoga, you probably don't play the same music, you play much more relaxing, because this idea of entrainment that Milton mentioned at the beginning, where our bodies intuitively start to move our pulse rate and our blood pressure in the direction
What's interesting is if you take a classic metronome, it goes from 40 to about 180, which is like an athlete at rest to being late for an exam.
That's true, yeah. That's
so
good, yeah.
it maps, I don't know what a coincidence it is, but it seems to map very closely to our...
You just keep a little metronome in your pocket when you're running late for the train and just kind of accelerate as you go. I mean, actually, that's one of the interesting applications. So, for example, people now are starting to look quite seriously about whether you can pipe music to encourage crowd behaviors. So, for instance, in a crowded train station, you might want to pipe music that slows everyone down to stop them jostling. Conversely, if you want everyone to get out of the football stadium as fast as possible at the end, you might up the tempo to get them out. And of course, much more negatively, we are familiar with this use of music as a kind of torture instrument in places like Guantanamo Bay, but also in other jurisdictions around the world, which is pretty miserable, I have to say. And I don't want to end on a miserable one, so let me end on perhaps the most exciting bit, I think, which is this idea that music might be playing a really important role in maintaining day-to-day health. Because we know that when you listen to music, any music that you like, your cortisol levels, which is this molecule over here, start to drop. And cortisol is a stress hormone that normally, when it's present at high levels, can start to inhibit the activity of your immune system, particularly these little green cells over here, which are T cells, whose role is to protect you from viruses. Normally, you don't want these cells to be inhibited. You want them to be doing this and looking for a virus and killing it. So you want to lower your cortisol levels. And consequently, we can see, in fact, that if you play someone a piece of music they like, their T cell function improves at the end of that piece of music, which I think is a really nice note to end on, because it means that regardless of whether your idea of a good night out is a bit of a classical concert or some death metal, you are probably doing a world of power to your immune system and keeping yourself very happy indeed. And on that note, let me finish with a final.
Professor
Thank you very
Robert
much.
May. Thank you so much.